Sure. So, Tom Jennings, I'm in Buffalo, New York. When I tell candidates I'm in New York, they pretty well almost always assume I'm in New York City, but Buffalo is a good 8 hours north, super close to Canada. I'm right by Niagara Falls, actually. So, like most folks, I stumbled into recruiting out of the blue, right? I went to school for public relations, communications, and what ended up happening was I was forging this career in outside sales and digital marketing. Got a call from somebody, it was an agency based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, to come and start a recruiting career for their satellite office in Buffalo. So I spent about 3.5 years building up that satellite office with a partner, really growing that recruitment practice as sort of a generalist. Every discipline imaginable, we recruited it. And then, like most folks, when the pandemic hit, I was kind of forced to make a little bit of a career change. Not complete career change, but I ended up heading over to my current firm, which is Selective Staffing Solutions. They've operated for about 16 years, primarily as a temp staffing agency, but really needed some expertise in executive search. So I'm coming up on year 2 of spearheading the executive search practice, again, sort of as a generalist, but really focusing heavily on the Western New York market. So I think it's really important to set up some email alerts from different industry sites. We do really well. We're members of the American Staffing Association. I know they pump out a ton of information. SHRM, or Society for Human Resource Management, can give you some insight into what maybe some of our clients are seeing and thinking. But the best advice I can give recruiters is to really learn from your clients and your candidates. Just don't be afraid to ask them what they're seeing, what they believe the trends are. Clients in particular will be very forthright with you. Hey, of all the jobs we're recruiting, we're seeing everybody's requesting remote. That type of thing, because trends on a national level or in certain market segments might not always apply to where you're recruiting or what segments you're recruiting in. So the best place to learn from are the people that you're talking to every day. So, markets shift seemingly in the blink of an eye. Folks that have been in this industry even longer than I talk about, recessions in 2008 and different things that have really impacted recruitment over the years. I think the biggest thing is just be prepared to be agile and really, really double down on the relationships that you're making now. I think when you first start out as a recruiter, it's really easy to get caught up in the day-to-day transactional kind of moving placement to placement. But where you really excel in recruiting is when you start to think long-term. Really double down on the relationships that you're building today, because even if the market flips and we have difficulties finding clients, which many recruitment firms are not dealing with now because demands are so high, those solid foundations that you build today will last through whatever happens in the market in the future. Gosh, I think you can do an entire episode on challenges that recruiters face, but you can really sum it up into one thing. We are in the business of dealing with people, and people are one heck of a variable, right? People's life situations change, people's motivations may change, people just straight up change their mind. Clients, clients and recruiters alike, right? So I think that the biggest challenge that you're always going to face is that you're dealing with a volatile variable. That might be double V squared. Maybe we'll coin that someday. But just remember that you're always dealing with people, and things can change in an instant. So tips and tricks, I think there's hundreds of them, but a lot of it comes down to character traits. I think when you're first starting out in recruiting, you need to be very adaptable. Realize we've talked about this a bit already, but times change, people change. Be prepared to be agile and adaptable. Number one. Number two, you have to be resilient. Recruiting can be a bit of a roller coaster. There's high highs, low lows. Understand how to push through some of those low lows to get to the next high. So resiliency would be my number two. Number three, learn how to really build strong relationships quickly. In those first 1, 2, 3, 4 calls with candidates, you'll come to realize as you get farther in your recruiting career that it is actually pretty high touch. Even if you're working, especially executive search with one candidate on one opportunity, you can talk to them dozens of times until they get that offer. But be really good at building a solid relationship very early. So that would be probably my number, that'd be 3 or 4. I think 3. Number 4, have an eagerness to constantly get better. You have to be the kind of person that learn how to never settle. Even people that have been doing this for 20, 30 years will tell you there's always something they can improve on, and they're always eager to learn, especially as market shifts. But number 5, and my most important, is focus your efforts on building your emotional intelligence. That's the biggest one. Being smart in this industry helps a little bit, but nothing compares to your EQ, because that, again, it's the foundation of building relationships, understanding candidates, their motivations. Same goes for clients. A high EQ is what will ultimately take you much farther in recruiting than any other skill. So, when a candidate ghosts, it really comes down to determining the why. And if that why is anything other than, some sort of catastrophic event in their life or something like that, I tell junior recruiters, don't get hung up on it. You quote unquote dodged a bullet, because the reality is, if that's kind of how they handle themselves and they're comfortable just sort of ghosting an engagement, that's probably not a candidate you want to represent to your clients anyhow. And I know that sounds a little mean, but if you think about yourself and think about the standards that you hold yourself accountable to, because number one, the first thing you want to do is hold yourself accountable to not ghosting somebody else. And getting them to come around, I don't think there actually is a getting them to come around. If things have happened, and as I've gone through my career, I've had candidates whose spouses died, randomly in the middle of the process and things like that. So there's expectations that things may happen where people may, disappear for a period of time, but that's not really the same as ghosting. If somebody's truly ghosting you, my recommendation is don't focus on getting them to come around. Just walk away and move on to the next one, because the reality was they're not the best candidate. So, things like the talent shortage, the best advice I can give is really get something out of everything, which sounds like a mass oversimplification of things, but because it is much harder to find candidates in this kind of talent short market, it's really important that you make the most out of every contact that you have. Don't be afraid to ask candidates you're working with for referrals. When you do happen to get in contact with somebody, even if they reject you and they say, hey, I'm not interested in this opportunity right now, take an opportunity to ask them for a quick call, get to know them, add them to your pipeline, because you never know if a job order that's appropriate for them is going to come a month down the road. Just make the most out of every single interaction that you're fortunate to get. And eventually, you'll weather, I think, this talent shortage. The first thing I always look for is career progression. So I know we talk a lot about job hoppiness as a thing, and that's not something that typically, quote unquote, concerns me. What I'm typically looking for is somebody that has, when I watch all the steps in their career, that they're making some sort of progress. It tells me that other organizations trusted them to advance them. It also tells me that they're interested in their advancement, because chances are I'm reaching out to them about an opportunity, that'll move them forward in their career. And it tells me that they're motivated by that. So that's ultimately what kind of ends up being some of your best targets when you're sourcing. I think the best thing is to ask second and third layer questions. I think it's really easy when you first start out in recruiting to ask kind of those top of line questions and then start to make assumptions, which can get you in trouble. A really good example, let's say you have a client who's looking for a specific level of Excel skills. I think when you first start recruiting, it might be on your script, and you might call the candidate and be like, "Oh, are you experienced with Excel?" And that candidate says yes. And then you mark them down as having Excel experience, represent them to your client as having Excel experience. But maybe what that candidate meant was, yeah, they used it in college 10 years ago, which isn't the same. So you have to really get comfortable with asking second, third, fourth layer questions. In the case of Excel, great, where did you use it? How often did you use it? What did you use it for? Can you do, not to go off on a tangent, but can you do, VLOOKUPs, pivot tables, really getting into some of those details so that when you go to present that person to your client, you're really knowledgeable and you never get caught off guard if in the interview process they say, they don't have the Excel skills that we're looking for, because you only asked a very, broad-based first level question. You really just have to get comfortable probing. I think it's just, dive into the details with candidates, and you are, first off, the candidate's going to be grateful that you're taking the opportunity to understand that. But two, what a lot of, especially for junior recruiters, what's happening is you're also learning. You're catching on to trends. You're letting candidates educate you about things that you might not have known before. So me personally, I can't use Excel for barely anything. I'm horrible at it, but I can talk about it like I know how to do it, because I let candidates educate me by asking those questions over the years. I think, especially when you're first starting out, it's really overwhelming when you start sourcing for the first time. I'll use an example. The first job order I ever worked on was an accounting manager. The first thing I did, and recruiters that are listening that are in finance and accounting will appreciate this, is I reached out to every controller in my market. Because in my head, not understanding the industry yet, what I was telling myself was, well, controller, I know that's a management level accountant, that must be appropriate for this job. But ultimately what ended up happening is I wasted a ton of time. I ticked off a lot of potential candidates by, reaching out to them about a job they weren't even remotely interested in. It wasn't even close to the salary range. But it was just me being naive. And that's going to happen naturally, especially when you're first starting out as a recruiter. So, one of the ways to avoid that is just really find a good mentor and ask them to double check your that's ultimately what helped me, is when I first started sourcing and going through lists, and it can be overwhelming, especially when you're kind of jumping from job to job. I would find somebody in my organization who knew a lot about that vertical and just say, hey, can you just give this a once over? And not dive into every single candidate on that level, but an experienced recruiter can look at one of your lists and say, yeah, you're on the right track, or you're way off the mark, and prevent a lot of headaches for you down the line. So I always advise junior recruiters, throw all the little tricks out the window. Be transparent. I think in a lot of sales tactics, and I was in sales for a long time before I jumped into recruiting, are all about like, how do we sort of trick somebody into speaking with you? And it doesn't really work that way when you're dealing in people, right? So I always say, just be empathetic. High EQ will really help here, and be transparent. When I'm cold calling candidates, I'm right off the bat, hey, I realize I'm speaking to you at work, but I have this opportunity I really want to talk to you about. When can I grab you here for 10 minutes? It's very straightforward. It is, again, I'm not tricking anybody into any conversation, anything like that they don't want to have. Because at the end of the day, if you're honest, you're straightforward, you're transparent, you're very passionate about what you're calling about, and your sourcing's great, and that the person that you're reaching out to really should be interested in the opportunity that you're pitching, you'll be successful with candidates. And then on the flip side, on the client side, if you think for one instant that your contacts are not getting cold called by every other recruiter in the market, you're wrong. So just be different. Be transparent, but be different at the same time. Don't lead down this path of, let me ask you 10,000 irrelevant questions to quote unquote build a relationship. Because truth be told, when you're cold calling clients, you're not relationship building. Our clients do not work with recruiters because they like them. They work with you because you're going to offer value to them. You're going to fix a problem that they don't have. You're a problem that they have. You're going to give them, talent that they don't have access to. How you keep them is that relationship and how you deliver and whether or not they like you. But you're not doing that when you're cold calling. So throw out all the hi, how are yous and all that, stuff in the beginning, and really just come out right and say, hey, I genuinely believe I can offer you value. Give me a shot, and you'll win more than you lose that way. A lot of the red flags come out of their job movements. When you're asking people why they made certain changes in their career, if you start catching these trends of, well, I had an issue with my manager, then I had an issue with another manager, and then I had another issue with a manager. Sometimes you wonder maybe that candidate is actually the issue. I think that's number one. Number two, you'll get very used to kind of verifying your information. And what I mean by that is if they have certain dates on the resume that might not match a LinkedIn profile, or they're talking about a job that's not on their resume. Anytime a candidate's withholding information, especially early on, is generally indication they're going to be withholding information from you throughout the process and withhold information from your clients. And that's usually just a flag that goes up and a candidate I move on from, because it really takes full transparency on both sides to make a successful placement with somebody.